many different mixed reality or MR applications, especially if you generalize a robot to mean any autonomous agent, physical and/or virtual. Some of the most interesting applications use physical robots to represent mixed agents, which are embodied in both the physical and virtual environments of the MR scenario, so they can interact with a human user through different modalities. In general, the human user in an MR scenario is a mixed agent as well. A natural problem that appears is collocation, which is our ability to keep an agent at the same configuration, meaning location and rotation, in both the physical and virtual environments. Additionally, the mixed agent needs to abide by constraints in both environments, which can include other agents and obstacles that only exist in real life, the virtual experience, or both. In this paper, we develop a framework for addressing these problems, describe some general observed solutions, and look at different case studies demonstrating the observed methods. First, we classify the type of collocation problem using 3 factors: agent embodiment, agent mobility, and inter-environment mobility. Starting with embodiment, which describes which environments the agent can affect, we find the following embodiment types. A virtual-only embodiment only exists in the virtual environment, such as a virtual AI-driven human character. A physical-only embodiment only exists in the physical environment, such as a real human observer watching the user or sharing the physical environment somehow. A mixed embodiment exists in both environments, with the assumption that the virtual and physical bodies have some form of coupled movement, meaning the virtual avatar usually follows the physical agent. Next, we look at mobility and the duality of mobility. Since we also care about static objects which are not agents, we look at any geometric constraint, including both agents and static objects. A static constraint is one that never moves, such as a wall. A dynamic constraint can move, such as a walking human user. Duality in constraints refers to whether or not the virtual and physical bodies of a mixed agent have the same mobility type. If there is no duality in constraint mobility, then both physical and virtual bodies are either both static or both dynamic, which we call static and dynamic mixed constraints, respectively. A passive haptic object is an example of a static mixed constraint, while most robots and humans would be dynamic mixed constraints. Dual constraints can either be virtually static and physically dynamic, or virtually dynamic and physically static. For example, only the physical body of the furniture robot is allowed to move. Finally, we look at inter-environment mobility, which refers to whether or not a mixed agent's bodies undergo one-to-one motion. If there is no inter-environment mobility, then all agent motions are one-to-one, such as when the virtual and physical environments are the same size. As long as the body configurations are calibrated well initially, then no more work needs to be done to keep them co-located. If there is discontinuous mobility, the agent's bodies can undergo a sudden major decoupling that completely separates the bodies. This can happen locally or globally. Local discontinuities are cases like tracking errors. Global discontinuities would be when the agent decides to switch to a different avatar or the user teleports. In either case, if the agent is totally static, the only solution is to undo the coupling because they can't correct themselves. Otherwise, the dynamic body can rush to the static one, as in this furniture robot example, or dynamic bodies can rush to each other to recouple themselves. If there is continuous mobility, the agent's bodies can slightly decouple, but slightly enough that it can be continuously and quickly corrected. Again, this can be local or global. A local example would be trajectory smoothing, like with surgical robots. A global example would be a locomotion method like redirected walking. These cases require one of the agent's bodies to move to the other as fast as the decoupling occurs, possibly keeping both bodies in motion to mask the discrepancy as this robot dog does. Once again, if both bodies are static, then little can be done besides undoing the decoupling or weighting it to keep the important objects co-located, as this passive haptic example does. With this classification framework, we can now look at some general solutions for handling constraints in different cases. In general, an agent navigates around a static constraint by using a roadmap, aka a navigation mesh, which describes walkable surfaces in the environment and returns the shortest navigable path to a waypoint. Locally, roadmaps use the static constraint surface geometry and navigational parameters, and globally, they merge all local results into a single global mixed roadmap that includes all static virtual and physical constraints. We see roadmaps used in many applications. For example, this robot dog knows how to avoid moving through buildings by using the roadmap to generate its desired path. An agent can navigate dynamic constraints in a few ways. Locally, they can use collision avoidance algorithms like reciprocal velocity obstacles, or RVO, which zoom into the interacting agents and tell them how to move to avoid each other in this circumstance. Globally, it is possible to regenerate a roadmap every time step and treat dynamic agents like static constraints in each frame, although the local method is typically more efficient. We see such methods being used in the furniture robot example, which uses RVO to make the robots move around each other and the human. The robot dog also uses RVO to navigate around the virtual agents walking around the scene. In all of these cases, for mixed agents, the resulting motion parameters should be applied similarly to both embodiments, accounting for decoupling when possible. This concludes our general framework for classifying collocation problems, which we hope can make it easier to break down future complex mixed reality robotics applications into smaller and better understood problems. Thanks for watching.